Hello, everyone. I am Jamie Dokovna with Becker and Polyakoff. I am a shareholder, and I'm here today with Dr. Shanequa Fleming, who's amazing. She is a CEO and founder of Culture Accelerators. She is a consultant, and she provides help for organization and for executive leaders that help them reimagine, repurpose, and optimize how they do business to ensure long-term growth and stability. And we are here today to talk to you about going back to work and what that means and what it looks like, and to also talk to you about concerns that employers have, that employees have, what to do about those concerns, and where we're headed in the future. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and we're going to try to give you some information that will be helpful, hopefully, to all of you. And to also answer some of your questions, we got lots of really great questions. And so we're going to try to integrate some of those in, and then to also answer them at the end if we don't get to everyone's question. And if you really like us, maybe we'll be back for another webinar, part 2, or maybe some other candid conversations later on. But the big question I think that everyone is asking right now is, are we reopening too soon? And we had a great question from Crystal. Hopefully Crystal is listening, and she had asked, what does it look like? Are people ready to come back to work? And 55% of Americans say that they think businesses are opening too soon. So that's a good chunk of your workforce that is saying that they don't necessarily feel comfortable coming to work. So Shanequa, what do we do to reconcile how employees are feeling ambivalent about coming back to work, but at the same time recognizing that business owners and executives have to get back to business?
Right. Well, first of all, Jamie, thank you and the Becker team for having me on today. I like that question, and I want to back up a bit to just a phrase that we've all been using, and this whole return to work phrase. I actually don't really even like the phrase because many people have been working and continue to work. So I think what you and we talked about this off camera, right? We talked about how do we really return to the workplace. And so when we think about that and we talk about re-entering, I think we need to first couch the conversation with the fact that we are not just rebooting our operations. We're in fact reestablishing and rebuilding trust in people so that they feel comfortable to come back in and perform and be productive and solve problems and bring solutions, which is why we all, take part in the things that we do. So I think we start the conversation there. And, many people are looking at the operational things, but I'm going to be here to provide some context about what do we really need to think about as it relates to really helping employees to reset, because it's more of a reset than it is anything else. And it really begins mindset, skill set, and then tool set as it relates to how do we, bring our best and be our best at work.
Well, so I like that and what you're saying about, mindset, because, and I think that really is key. How do you get people in the right frame of mind, understanding, like what you said, there have been businesses that have continued to operate. And at the same time, a lot of these businesses, have been operating in some cases at half staff, and now they're trying to reintegrate. And one of the questions, I should say, it was actually a lot of people that had asked this question about making sure that the workplace is safe. And for some employers, they've already been doing it, but for others, this is something that's new for them. So how do they go about creating that trust?
That's another great question. And again, I think it begins with, like you said, a lot of people have been doing a lot of things and are being very proactive. I think the first thing is to start with communication, and communicating that there is a plan, there isn't a plan and we're developing a plan, or just being really transparent and honest about, where you are in this phase, because the worst thing we can do is to withhold information from people, because then we make up our own stories, right? And then we go with that and we generalize, or we create narratives that may or may not be true, but they become the truth because there's nothing else there. And so I think the first thing is to definitely communicate and be transparent. I believe that everybody in the organization needs to get the same information and the same message. It might be delivered a little differently, but I think we start there. And as we think about that, and as we start to, transition back, to really think about what's the best way to re-enter the workplace, if we've left our actual physical, dwellings or what have you, what's the best way to actually do that? And beginning with, first of all, what is the plan? And as we think about what that plan is, who needs to be involved in that plan? This is definitely a time where the HR executive is going to be extremely important to the organizational move forward, if you will. And if a company may not have someone dedicated to that, hopefully they're tuning into this conversations and other conversations such as this one, so that they can get the information to know what's needed. So that's where we start.
No, and I think that's a great point, because it's actually interesting, and it reminds me, the CDC just came out with guidelines about going back to work. And as I mentioned in the last webinar, and I still believe today, the CDC is going to be one of the main sources of information, especially for employers as they continue to work or as they go back to work. And they have established certain guidelines. And one of the things, of course, that they've mentioned is having this plan in place. And what does this plan look like? And importantly, and what I like about what you said, because it's one of the things that I actually highlighted in what I read, was that, employers should be thinking about designating a person, whether it's an HR or another individual in the workplace, that's sort of going to be the source, a person that employees can communicate with about concerns about COVID-19, and who they can communicate with, which is important, like what you've talked about, that they can reach out to them if, for example, they're sick or they have concerns about safety or things like that. And so that should be one of the tools that people are utilizing, really as a backdrop as we, continue to operate and really get going for others.
Right. I think something else that we've got to talk about is the safety and the health of employees. And so I know that there is great, excitement and on both sides of the spectrum of excitement about going back to work. But I think if we start that with a clear message about what we're doing in terms of safeguarding the health and safety of employees, it makes for a much smoother transition. There's several categories. I've had several conversations this week with different organizations about what they're doing to actually, take that next step to re-entering the workplace. And one thing is letting employees know, first of all, what are you doing to make sure that they are, if they're ready to go back to work, because that's a whole nother conversation, right? There are a lot of employees that aren't ready. We saw the stats. More than half of people are saying, no, we're going back too soon. And so if that is a reflection of what the rest of the world, especially our country, is thinking right now, that becomes a reality in the workplace, and we cannot ignore that. And so as an employer, it's our responsibility to make sure that we are taking those steps to make sure we're addressing those concerns, because the first thing is, if people don't feel safe, they're not going to show up. And yes, we can sit here and we can talk about the legalities of it, but compliance is never going to get us the type of response that we want alone. There are some things that I'm sure we need to talk about as it relates to that, but we really want to make sure that we're communicating and we're connecting with people so that they understand what are those measures we're taking, so that they feel safe, that they know they are safe, and that they are in an environment where their health is not going to be compromised.
No, absolutely. I mean, and, like I was saying, the great thing is right now there are a lot of sources that employers and organizations can look to and utilize, and they really have to adapt what makes sense for them, because I don't think there really is a one size fits all. And listen, these are guidelines, and as employers, and as employees, we're all too familiar with guidelines because it really is what gives us context, and structure as we move forward. Some of the safety things you're going to hear over and over and over again until we have a vaccine. I mean, they're going to drill it into your brains, the things that you need to be doing in the workplace, making sure that your employees wash their hands frequently, making sure that you provide that soap or sanitizer with at least 60% alcohol. But key is that social distancing that they're going to be looking for unless or until we reach high levels of immunity or until we get a vaccine. They're really going to insist on that as we continue to operate. And those are the kinds of measures, like what you were saying, Shanequa, we need to really effectively communicate what specifically we are doing for employees, because we have to worry as employers about how are we going to ensure that our employees are safe, that our customers are safe, and that we feel comfortable continuing to operate. And so it doesn't reflect negatively on us as an organization because we're not taking care of our assets, the customers, and importantly your own people.
Right. Jamie, I love that. And, I think I started by saying having a detailed relaunch plan. So of course, a big part of that relaunch plan has to do with health and safety. But I think the other part, we now need to start shifting our thinking to what are we going to do so that work functions get back to a place of rhythm and cadence, right? And I was careful not to use the word normal, because what we knew before the pandemic will not be the work environment, will not be the work context that we are reintroduced to. So I think it's important for us to also maybe bring something into this conversation where we talk about what will work be like for us moving forward, after, we've had such an experience as this.
No, and I think that's really important and interesting, because it reminds me that I had seen some drawings that I want to share with everyone that Cushman and Wakefield had put together, and they're just drawings and renderings of what they envision the workplace will look like. And it's this concept of the 6-foot office space. And of course, what Cushman and Wakefield are doing doesn't necessarily translate across the board to every organization, but it's just some of the things that you'll see. For example, having plexiglass as a divider in a workspace, having markings in particular areas so people know that they need to stay out of that space to maintain distance. Having signs in the workplace to show people how they need to move through the office space. I had even read about making sure that people move through the office either clockwise or counterclockwise. So we sort of have this idea of, like a one-way street, where people just move through the office and everyone, sort of moves in synchronicity to get through the off space so people aren't running into one another. So I think it's really interesting because, it's like I said, it's what they envision, and, it doesn't necessarily work for other people, but what's so great about it is it really, in my mind, sort of becomes this springboard of what can you do to make it work for you in your organization?
Well, definitely a lot of people are going back to a physical environment, if you will. But something you said when you talked about synchronicity, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that asynchronous and synchronous communication and connection is definitely more real for us now than it's ever been. And so when we think about the physical work environment, there are a whole lot of pieces there, but we've also got to think about what we've really taken a deep dive into, which is the virtual work environment. It's something that I talk about a lot in terms of the digital revolution. And when we think about what does that mean, a lot of organizations have found themselves in a place where they weren't ready. They weren't ready for this type of digital experience and this technological shift that we've seen. And so what does that mean now for organizations? So I know there are a lot of things that people are looking at and they're saying, wow, this is going to be really different for us in a way that maybe we're seeing it as a not so positive thing. I hope organizations really focus on how do we look at this to really reimagine what we do and how we do it, and be able to do it in a way that makes us even more effective. And so this is a great opportunity to evolve. This is a great opportunity to look at our practices and really bring new things to life, and really look at how can we create greater efficiencies in our organization, given something that has always been available to us, and now we've just gotten a crash course on it.
No, absolutely. And, it's interesting because it's obviously very timely. And I had read another article about, big tech businesses and how a lot of these big tech companies have moved to remote work and telework. And a lot of businesses have done it for years. A lot of people have done telework for years. And I think what's interesting is, from my perspective, I think that you will continue to see in the future this concept of telework. I do think that companies will, really because they have to embrace it. And I think one of the things that's been pretty eye-opening from the perspective of the employer is that it works. And we're actually seeing, at least in the short term, that people can be productive working from home and working remotely. And, so what do we do about that? And is it something that we then can utilize to bring in, good people that are, looking maybe for remote work? Maybe it's a benefit that we offer when we're onboarding. And, so it's, what does that look like? And, like what you said, we weren't necessarily ready for it, but here we are. So we have to deal with it, and we have to, make lemonade out of lemons, right?
We sure do. You bring up another really great point, Jamie, and that is that the talent pipeline has opened up to the world for us. And so when we think about the way we work and how we work, we're able to go beyond those geographical boundaries, if you will, that keep us looking at talent in certain ways. In fact, I was just in a strategy session this week with a client where we were looking at work hubs, creating work hubs for them to do what they do in ways that will be more cost effective, because they're able to tap into talent in the areas where they need it when they need it, instead of maybe having these people always available. So the gig economy, again, another concept that really has been floating out there. It is really taking its legs in this one. And so I think it's important for us to look at that as well. You said one other thing. I want to make sure I loop back to that as well. When we think about how we're planning, traditional strategic planning is not going to help us navigate this period of uncertainty in a way. And I bring up that word uncertainty because everyone's harping on uncertainty, but there's actually a lot more certainty during this time than we've actually allowed ourselves to see. And so when we think about planning for the future, that uncertainty is minimized when we can look at what are those drivers in our industries, and what are the two most uncertain drivers, and create some plausible scenarios that could occur if we find ourselves experiencing certain things. And so it gives us that strategic flexibility. So when we find ourselves in a situation that we didn't plan for, we have more ability to pivot than we may have had we not planned that way.
No, and I think that's super important, because it's one of the things that I've been stressing since the very beginning. And I think you'll continue to see that, this idea of flexibility, and, how do you use that flexibility, one, to make it work for you, to make it work for employees. And then, by the way, in being flexible, I think it gives you that opportunity to really pivot when you need to, because sometimes you can be flexible, whether it's bringing people back, whether it's, allowing them, if they don't feel comfortable coming back to work. Because, listen, I think we'd all agree that it's not productive to bring people back to work who don't want to come back to work. And, it's interesting because we have a question from Cynthia, and she had asked, it's like, well, why would people want to come back if they're making more money on unemployment? And, I think that's a great question, Cynthia. And listen, I have clients that have that problem, and it's real. And the reality of it is that, we all know that that's a short-term solution. It's not a long-term fix. We can't have everyone out of work and the government supporting us while we stay home and wait for a vaccine. We just don't have that luxury. Businesses don't have that luxury. And so while in the short term, it may be true, and it may be true of some individuals, you know, a lot of people, you know, do want to come back to work. And maybe, you know, that when we pose that question and you see these high numbers of people that think we're reopening too soon, maybe it goes back to, you know, this idea of having, you know, maybe some lack of communication. And they don't know that you as an employer have taken steps, that you have a plan, that you're doing things to make sure that the workplace is safe for them and that they feel safe to come back.
Right. So we've got to communicate, communicate, and communicate. Something else I just heard you say, I think is important for us to touch on is, what do we do when we're ready to reopen and people aren't ready to come back to work? We got that question as well. And I don't remember who asked that one, but that was a really great question. So I want to hear what your thoughts are from a legal perspective.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you know, it's interesting because, you know, one of, hopefully she's listening, and Elaine had asked, and you know, actually Elaine and I had talked the other day, so I don't know if she's on the web and listening to us, but she actually shared with me that she has a lot of workers that are very ambivalent about coming back, and that, you know, she's really taken the approach of, I will let them sort of make the decision about when they're ready to come back. And, you know, from my perspective, I thought it was so fascinating, because it was really this change in dialogue that I've become so accustomed to, where the employer, you know, the mindset is I'm in the driver's seat, I'm controlling sort of the workspace, I'm deciding how, the who, the what, the where, the how, all that stuff. And it's interesting because, you know, I've seen this shift, and I don't think it's unique to her, you know, to her organization, that, you know, there's really this concept and this idea that employers are sort of, you know, treading on new territory, and it's very uncomfortable. And, you know, the reality is people cannot refuse to come to work. If you are open for business, people need to come back to work. And there are things that you can do to make sure that employees, even in high risk groups, are safe to come back to work, and employees should feel safe to communicate that. But like I said, you know, they need to come back to work. The standard legally is very high for an employee to prove that he or she is not safe in the workspace. You know, they have to be in imminent danger. And I think, you know, in these times, people will be hard pressed to say, and at least we're not at that space, at least not today, where if you come to work where your employer is otherwise taking measures to make sure you're safe, that if you go to work, you're going to be in imminent danger. So, you know, and I think it sort of goes back to the communication. You know, you got to communicate with them, you know, listen, we're doing the things that we need to do, but you have to come back.
Absolutely. That communication and transparency of the process. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I've seen that also with clients, where leaders that typically are very action oriented, they're slowing down a bit, or even in some cases freezing. And so the thing that we cannot dismiss is that the change happened when we were given orders to stay in, and we saw people, we saw us losing lives to this pandemic. It's the transition that takes time. And so change happens immediately, but transition takes time. And we often talk about, you know, leaving our emotions out of it. That is absolutely impossible. Our emotions make the decisions, and our logical brain always follows suit. And so as soon as we understand that, and we communicate and we relate according to that, then we can make more decisive movements, and we can make adjustments as they're needed. And so we have this whole fight or flight, couldn't get that out. But there's also freeze. And so in that freeze moment, it's important that as a leader, yes, you're having to make decisions and you don't have a lot of the information you need, but that's a part of it. Sometimes we've got to make decisions with only 60% of the information, but we're making those decisions because we have other things in our toolkit, hopefully, that allows us to navigate, such as our people. You don't have to know everything, but you do need a team of people around you advising, so that you're making decisions and you're taking everyone into consideration as it relates to how do we we make sure we move forward? And so to your point, when you have done all of those things, you've been transparent, you've created a detailed relaunch plan, you've been transparent in your communications, you've been thorough, and you've connected, and there's still things that, employees are saying they're not going to do. That's where that thin line, and we talked about this, Jamie, that thin line between, really being an employer of choice and having an employee relations issue on your hand. And that's when a great conversation with you comes into play, because now we have another situation. And so we just want to make sure as a leader, we're doing everything within our ability to be compassionate, to be caring, but we also have to understand that we've got to get back to a sense of rhythm and cadence that allows us to move forward, not just as an employer, but as a country.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think this idea of, being what I always say is like a deer in headlights, you freeze. And I don't really think that, we have the luxury to do that anymore. I mean, we are now at a space where, we're, pretty much 90 days in to experience this sort of, shelter in place, the new normal, the new abnormal. And, we really have to get beyond it, because, we can't just, sort of, operate in the right now. We also do need to be proactive, and we have to be looking forward to, what is business going to look like, in the next, month, 2 months, 3 months. And well, listen, we're certainly not all, clairvoyant. And although it's a skill I wish I had, I don't. But, at least to be able to look based on kind of what we already know, right, and what we think based on what we know is what is going to be that, transition period, that temporary, what I'll call the temporary new normal, because right, I don't think this is forever. No. It's a transition. We're going to have to go through the process. We'll get out on the other side. There will be certain things like what you said, that will be lasting, and that we will now adopt and incorporate in how we do business moving forward, but I certainly think that there are going to be a lot of things that we, good riddance, leave behind.
Right. I like that. And, I go back to the question you started with, are we re-entering too soon? And I'd like to propose a few things to help us really answer that question from an objective perspective, because the yes and no's that we've gotten, most of those yeses and no's are coming from a place of emotional response, right? Because that's where we go first. And so I think as an employer, this is where I would say, let's helicopter up just a bit and let's identify a few things. Do you have a detailed relaunch plan? Right. And if you don't have one, what are the things you need to be considering as you relaunch the way that you need to work moving forward? And then the second question I would ask is, what are those factors you're using to assess whether or not you're ready to return to the workplace or return to, your cadence of work as you've known it before, whether it's evolved or otherwise? Because if you do not have measures of success, you will not know if what you're doing is effective or not. So we've got to have a way to measure it. And if we can't measure it, then we don't really know what has happened. The other thing is, I would say, look at where are you more likely to have missteps in your process, or in your practice, or in your communication, wherever it is, and be sure to have someone think that through with you. Invite employees in. All of the reasons that people are probably not ready to come back to work, if you open up the dialogue and ask them, they'll tell you. And then you'll be able to be more responsive instead of being reactive. And the other thing I would say is, as you take this approach, phase it. Phases always work well, because it gives you an opportunity to see what works, where do we need to make adjustments, and where can we go a little faster on some things, and where might we need to, call in help, or whatever, the case might be. So I would say begin with those things if you haven't already done that. The last thing I would say is, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of stuff out there that we can look at in terms of resources from the CDC on, just protocols and practices that we should have. Look at other organizations in your industry. I was having that conversation with another group this week, and one of the things I said is, you don't realize that people are looking at you as a leader in your industry. And so a lot of this could be about re-engaging as it relates to your business as usual, But in many cases, it's also because you're showing up as a leader for others and they're looking to you for best practices. And so that's just a part of it. You know, leadership goes first, and but it doesn't have to be lonely. There are a lot of resources. There are conversations like we're having today. And, you know, with that being said, I know that we want to open it up and answer other questions. So, you know, let's do that.
Yeah, well, you know, before we get there, I mean, one of the things I wanted to say, I mean, I think that, you know, that word is, you know, that measurement, that objective, and what are the things that you can do. And I know you and I have talked about that. And, you know, I kind of jokingly said, well, what do? You know, do you do surveys? And you had said, you know, like, yeah. Like, why not, Jamie? Like, of course. And, you know, I was like, oh, okay. You know, I mean, listen, I'm not really a big fan of surveys, but okay, I guess we should be doing that. But, you know, it's like, that's what's so important about the conversation we're having is, you know, that, you know, surveys can be a way that you can measure, you know, how people feel. And, you know, I also, I mean, I love what you're saying about, you know, talking to peers. I mean, you know, we, at a lot of times, you know, work collaboratively. I mean, for years, we've always, you know, heard this idea and this movement toward open spaces, toward communicating, you know, toward talking to other people.
Here we are.
Yeah, you know, and it really, you know, is key. And, you know, it's one of those other ways that you can sort of measure, what are we doing that works? What are you doing that works? And, you know, talking to other people, you know, one that maybe you think they're like you, and also importantly, people in businesses that may be a little different than yours, but are still peers, because it's important, you know, well, what are they doing? And it's not necessarily for you to incorporate and adopt everything that they're doing. You know, you have to figure out what works for you based on the information that you're receiving, you know, both from your employees, but, you know, also from, you know, surveys. And then, you know, importantly is other resources like the CDC, and trying to take that all in and figure out how to process that in a way that makes sense as we move forward.
And familiarize yourself with the resources that are out there, right? Because as we think about this, there's so many things that we could focus on, all of the not so positive things. But if we really look to all the advantages we could gain from this, new emerging markets are coming out from this. And so how can we look at what the core of our businesses, our organizations are, and how can we leverage that to really advance our mission? I mean, there are just so many different things that we could talk about. But I know today we're focusing on how do we really get ready, right? And so I think readiness starts in the mindset, and then making sure we have the tools that we need to really navigate the space in a way that's safe and healthy.
No, and well, it's funny because we have a question from Joanne, and Joanne asked about, you know, people are concerned about commuting to the workplace. And it's funny because I love the question, because, you know, you and me were so focused on, look, you're there, the workspace, you know, you're already at work. But, you know, before you even get there, I mean, you know, a very real reality is that some people have to rely on mass transit to get to work, and they need to feel safe even coming to work. And so, you know, what are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about in that regard? And I will mention, Joanne, just to let you know that the CDC, when they put out their updated guidelines, they did include information about transit workers and the things that you should be doing if you're providing mass transportation. And hopefully, you know, those, you know, state and local governments and agencies that are responsible for making sure that, you know, as we commute to work, it's safe.
Right. Right. So I think that part of the question would fall in line with all the other things we're doing to take those precautionary measures. But there is one other part to Joanne's question. As an employer, I think we've got to look at our policies, and we've got to look at our practices, right? I'm one for workplace workplace practices, but we've got to look at those to make sure we do have some latitude and we are giving some grace to people in terms of, whatever it might be as it relates to tardy policies or late policies and those kinds of things, because there's so many other factors that are hinged to this whole idea of returning, right? So there's some people that are returning and school is about to be out. So if you have school-age children, what does that mean for your commute? What does that mean for your transition time? What does that mean if someone is ill and you have to, attend to them? What does that mean if you have elderly parents or, even pets for that matter? So all of those things, when we talk about the commute, it's beyond that actual, getting from point A to point B, but it's also all of the things that happen or need to happen in order for you to have that smooth transition. So I think as an employer, as organizations, as leaders, we've got to think about those things. And again, you may already be doing them, but let's communicate them, because if people don't know, they will create a story. And when those stories get to, swirling around and being told to others, it creates a ripple effect that sometimes is hard to stop. So I think as we think about that part, let's also think about what our fiduciary responsibility is to make sure that we're creating a great place for people to work.
No, absolutely. And I think, sometimes to that point that, sometimes if you say it enough, it becomes their reality. And so I think that it's important to, really make sure that we are in control of the narrative, and that, that narrative is communicated in a truthful way, not so that it's, smoke and mirrors, but really so there's transparency in what we're doing. So it's more engaging, as opposed to something that, makes people, like what you were saying, either, freeze or retreat. You want them to engage.
Right. Something else that I think is important for us to maybe touch on, Jamie, is the whole idea of people feeling afraid or concerned to return to work with questions about, have others in their workspace been exposed to COVID-19? So what are your thoughts around that?
Well, I mean, listen, it's a very real possibility. I mean, and as scary as that sounds, and the reality is that even in spite of sometimes everything that you do to make the workplace safe, there are going to be people who may get sick. And if they get sick, what should you be doing as an employer to make sure that you're protecting the rest of your workforce? I mean, so some of the things that you should be considering, if somebody does test positive, that you make sure, like we were talking about with the HR, or having a person specifically that's designated for dealing with COVID-19, that they understand, they can have an open dialogue, that they can let you know that if they have tested positive. I know that, I sometimes see questions, and I did see a question that was submitted earlier about, HIPAA. And I will say, I mean, generally speaking, employers are not covered entities under HIPAA. I mean, they aren't covered entities under HIPAA. But they can learn, of protected health information because they're employers, if they learn from, for example, from insurance company, which is a covered entity under HIPAA. But if your employee just communicates to you that he or she has tested positive, that is information that, isn't a HIPAA issue. And I think at that point, it really is incumbent on you as an employer to make sure that your employees are safe. I mean, so obviously that individual should not be coming back to work, that they should not come back until they're at least symptom free for, I would, say if there's no fever, for at least, 24 hours. I mean, if they do in fact have COVID-19, you're looking at, 14-day quarantine. If that individual shows up at work, I mean, I think the things that the employer should be doing are making sure that, immediately for that, 24-hour space after you learn that information, that space should really be, roped off, whether it's, figurative or literal, so to make sure that nobody is entering into that space where that individual was. And then, you wait, the CDC is recommending at least 24 hours. If you can wait that long, if you can't, perhaps earlier, but then really to go in there and like deep clean, disinfect, and then also importantly, to let other people know that somebody has tested positive, I mean, you know, you don't give out their name. I think that's really the prevailing wisdom is, you know, we don't say so-and-so tested positive, but that we do say that someone has tested positive, so they make sure that they can then self-monitor, at least in the short term, to see if they start experiencing any of those signs and symptoms, which sort of reminds me, you know, that's one of the things that as we go back to work or as we continue to work, I have a lot of clients that are doing it already, but it's not something you have to do, but it's a tool, you know, like we were talking about, that people can utilize, like temperature checks, asking people whether they have sore throat or cough. And, you know, if they do, making sure that they don't enter into the workspace and tell them to stay home. And then, you know, I sort of comes full circle, you know, with that flexibility with, you know, your sick policies, with, you know, coming in late. You know, if you have an employee that said, yeah, listen, you know what, this morning I didn't feel so good, you know, my throat's starting to bother me. You know, I think it probably makes sense. And I think most of us would agree, stay home. You know, if you don't feel good, don't come to work. And then also importantly, you know, HR, your office managers, you know, just management, you should know that if you have employees who come to work and they're sick, first off, they shouldn't want to, but if they do because they feel compelled or that they have to because they have to work, you need to, you know, I guess be, well, kind of compassionate maybe, and to let them know, listen, take care of you. You're not good for any of us, and it's not good for our workspace if you're coming here and you're sick and you don't feel well, you're not productive, and it's not going to be productive for the rest of us, and you may end up, you know, making it worse both for yourself and for everybody else.
Right. I think this is one of those times where that practice, and I'm going to go with practice because policies never drive people to behavior, right? It's practice and it's reinforcement, and what gets rewarded gets repeated. And so I think in a situation like this is where I think there's that opportunity to really elevate culture, because the laws are the laws, but that doesn't keep people from breaking them, does it?
No,
They still break them. And
right.
so I think in a situation like this, even something as you said, whether it's physically or figuratively roping off an area, we've got to think about the affect of that as well, right? And so how do we make sure we maintain safety and health, and visibility of practices that are promoting that without creating a culture of disconnect? Because the last thing we want to do is create more angst and anxiety in the work environment. So we've really got to find that sweet spot between what we, you know, for what we do and how we do it. And so with that being said, I think that's one of the most beautiful things I get from this conversation with you is we're having a conversation that creates a nice melting pot, or a nice marmalade, I should say, because nothing goes away.
Right.
All the flavors are still here. A nice marmalade for what are our, you know, legal responsibilities and protections, if you will, and what are those things we do so that we really create connection and provide great leadership for our organizations and our companies.
No, I mean, and it's funny because what really comes to mind, because I work with people that, you know, are in the HR space all the time. And one of the things that I find, you know, so unique about a lot of people who are in HR, it's like, you know, they have this real dichotomy, you know, people don't like them because they enforce the rules, and then people love them because, right, you know, they're compassionate, and so a lot of people that are in that role and who, you know, in my opinion, do it really well, they have this, you know, kind of what I think, you know, it's that yin and yang, they go really well together, you know, and that it's these two parts of that personality, you know, where you allow employees to come to you, to tell you, to share information with you, and in the same, you know, vein, it's, you know, or maybe not, you know, rules because, you know, people won't follow them, but, you know, I guess, you know, what also comes to mind is culture. You know, it's how do we create that culture where people want to do those things, as opposed to feeling like it's something that's put on them that they may not necessarily want to comply with.
Right. And trust really is the amplifier of culture. It's the amplifier and the accelerator. And so all the things we've been talking about today is really how do we create a culture where people are trusting, number one, that as a leader, as an organization, you're doing the right thing and you're doing things right, even in this case. And also creating one where we can trust that those that work with us and are a part of this will also help to, highlight and bring about awareness for things that we need to know, as we are all moving through this together. I mean, we're 90 days or so somewhere, because I really haven't been counting. I think you told me that. So according to Jamie, we're 90 days in this, and we've never seen this before. And so as we're 90 days into this, we are clearly navigating something that the world in our time has never seen before. And the only other time something like this has occurred was the flu of 1918, and I wasn't born then, so right. So I don't really know.
If you are, that would be really scary. But yeah, no, I mean, and that's just the thing. I mean, it's, we are all living this in real time. I mean, we don't have, the playbook. I mean, we're creating the playbook as we go, and hopefully we never have to experience anything ever again like this in our lifetime. But the reality is we might. I mean, and I'm certainly not a person that would ever say, well, thank God we had SARS or the swine flu. But the fact that we have had those things, at least in our lifetime, that there at least is some, what I'll call the floor, the ground that we are now building upon, because we haven't seen anything that's as epic as this. We have seen something more on a small scale, and so it's really ramping up. And it's everyone is sort of, you hear that phrase, we're all in this together, but we sort of are, because we don't really have these experts who can say, well, back in the flu of 1918, here's what we did. Anyone who's alive that did live through that, I mean, they're really old and they were really, really young at the time. I mean, so, they weren't the drivers, they weren't the adults, they weren't the people who were experiencing it that, can then share with us, hey, this is what we did and this is what worked really great, or, this didn't work so well, but here's what we did.
Right. So I think it's important to keep the dialogue going. I think it's important to ask questions, and to know that you're not going to know everything in this, and it's okay. But there is access to information, and it's so important that, not only having that point person or those point people or individuals that are slated to kind of help you navigate the messages of this, but to speak with one voice. And to make sure that there's continuity and consistency with the message, and in the message, because anything that could create a crack in that, it creates a breakdown in trust. And once we lose trust, it becomes very difficult for us to do anything else. And so, a big part of this is understanding how do we rebuild and regain trust, and how do we renew trust. But then that will help us to reboot our operations, and then be able to create those shifts, if we will, and how we sustain and continue to create value.
No, and it's funny because it reminds me what I always say with, employers, management is your front line. I mean, these are your soldiers. They're the ones that are going to be, making sure that they're all on the same page. And I think that's, sort of you would say, I mean, in your experience in working with executives, is making sure that those people that are on the front line, so to speak, that they're all on the same page, because they need to be able to work with everybody else. They need to communicate that message on down to really make sure that everyone's on the same page, that we're all sort of, operating cohesively, as opposed to you have employees that think one way, you have management that thinks another way, and then, there's sort of chaos that ensues, and that's not really good for anybody, and it's certainly not good for an organization.
Right, and it's definitely not good for what we're trying to achieve, which is helping people to get back to their rhythm and cadence. What other questions do we have out there, Jamie? Is there anything else people are asking?
So one of the questions that I saw is, Julie is asking, and she's talking about employers, and particularly employees rather, excuse me, that have children. And, I don't think it's a secret really to anyone out there. And we know, listen, the reality is there are not a lot of places for kids to go. I mean, school is basically out. There are a lot of camps that are not opening. I mean, there are some here and there. And, what about these employees that are unable to return to work, and what kind of, I guess this is more of a legal question, but I will bring you in because I think it's important also to talk about, how you deal with that, just on a culture perspective, because listen, parents are in the workforce. Parents have to work. And the reality is, well, there are some rights that are in place and there is some protection in the law. Like, for example, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, it does provide paid leave to parents so they can be home with their children who are not sick, but just not in school. And it's up to 10 weeks. But the reality is I mean, I know for myself personally, I mean, school's out. I mean, pretty soon here. I mean, we're not like, some other states like New York that happen to go a little longer. But the reality is this is going to be a real problem in the workplace. And, I think that word sort of dovetails into flexibility. And, do you have the ability for these people, to either work remotely, or what can you do to be flexible for them? Maybe, for example, they work a different shift, or they work alternate shifts. There has to be something that makes sense for everybody, because the reality is that parents who work can't just stay home with their kids. Even though some may want to, there are plenty who either don't want to or really can't.
Right. No, Jamie, I think you responded to that. It's a matter of really thinking about what can you do to create an environment where everyone wins and where everyone can thrive. Because to your point, I mean, the legality of it is if you have a job, you're supposed to show up. And if you don't, then it's abandonment. I mean, we could really go that route. But given what we're dealing with, is there an opportunity to really allow people to really show you why you hired them in the first place, right? And so when we think about that, in the broader sense, the individuals that you have on your teams, that you have working in your organization, you hired them for many reasons. And probably at the top of that list would be that you hired them because they were, in fact, a great source of capabilities, meaning their skills and their knowledge and their abilities, but they also brought things to your organization that said they were someone that really embraced the culture and the values of the organization. And so now it's time to really bring those values to life when it matters most on the other side. And so otherwise they're just placards on the wall and things that we say, and we really should stop saying them. And so I think it's time for us to really show grace and latitude, but also keep measuring performance. I am, all for that. But I think if we really looked at this, we would see that when people can, meet their basic needs first, and they can respond to and attend to the things that are important to them, they will show up for you in a way that you can't even imagine, as it relates to what it is you need from them. Again, not neglecting that there needs to be measurement, but I think there needs to be a balance of latitude as well.
No, 100%. I mean, and I think, we really have proof of that, especially with remote work. I mean, we have seen, like I said, at least in the short term, that employees can and will come back to work. And sometimes it may be what feels like on their terms, but it's really a collaborative effort, that it's, something that employers and employees are working together. And it's about finding out what works. And those employees that are really good, that makes sense, that are good fit for your organization, they will, like what you said, they'll show up, they will come to work. And for those that can't or won't, I mean, I think we'd be remiss not to talk about it. I mean, because, the reality isn't everything always works, and, it's always the synergy that makes sense. I mean, unfortunately, there may be people that no longer fit into your organization, at least in the short term. And while, listen, no one wants these high unemployment numbers. I think, for the most part, although I haven't seen a survey on it, I'd like to believe, that assuming it was safe to go back to work, that most people would want to work. And, assuming that that's the case, I mean, there's going to be some, like I said, that fit, that makes sense, who show up, who will do what you need them to do. And unfortunately, there may be some people that, like I said, they don't fit with the employer, the culture right now. I mean, not to say forever, but maybe just not right now.
Right. What we do at the core really shouldn't change. How we do is where we've got to be flexible. So I really like that. I like the perspective that you brought to this conversation today. There was another thing that was swimming in my mind, and it's the whole notion of as we are re-engaging and as we're thinking about how we do things, I think it's also important for us to not dismiss the fact that there's some things that we just won't be able to recoup them the way that we think that we are. And so what does that mean? Yeah. What does that mean in terms of how do we elevate the work that we do and the way in which we do it? Because a lot of people are performing really well during this time. I've had clients that have had record-breaking, performance periods in various industries. And so people are making it happen. And so what do we do so that we really leverage that? What do we do so we highlight? And I think we've got to tell those stories. And I think we've got to share those stats because they really are important and they really are encouraging and they really are showing us examples of innovation. And so let's not shy away from that. Let's leverage that. Let's lean all the way into that. And
I agree, and listen, there are going to be a lot of employers, and I know because I've heard it from a lot of clients that really want to reward their employees who've shown up, who've come to work. We hear stories about that in the news, but, I know you and me, we've talked about, and we can relate to it on a personal level because we have clients that really do, and I hate using the word reward, but it's really more, showing appreciation that, hey, listen, that they really do appreciate that, that we're all in this together. I mean, sometimes there are going to be employers who will not be able to show their appreciation right now, but at least in the long term, I mean, I will tell you, and that what I've seen, it is, duly noted. We know who's come to work. We know who's shown up. We know who's sort of part of the team, and we know who's not. And, we'll make decisions about what makes sense for us as an organization as we move forward, sort of keeping all those things in mind.
Right. One last thing, Jamie, I'd like to mention is, we're talking about work. And I think I started by saying some people have not stopped working. So it is so critical for us to also understand how we maintain a sense of wellness during this time. Because even going back into those, into a rhythm and cadence that might look like what we knew before, we're bringing in some new habits. I'm not going to say bad ones. I'm just going to say we're bringing in some new habits of, there's really been no disconnect for many of us, right? So we get up, we're working, we're in the kitchen, we're doing whatever, and there's been no disconnect. So I think it's important for us to restore a sense of balance in our days, and a sense of wellness is what I meant to say, not balance, but a sense of wellness in our days, because if you didn't have it before, it either got a little bit more challenging, or it just became something that wasn't even a thought. And so that's really important, that as we find ourselves transitioning wherever we might be in that we make sure we think about how do we restore a sense of wellness, because it is impossible to work 24/7.
No, well, and listen, the reality is, I mean, we're finding that there are people that we're sort of all over the place, that there are people who are working 24/7, and then there are people who aren't working a whole lot. And, listen, I think we'd be remiss not to talk about it. And I'm glad that you brought it up because, there are a lot of employers, and I know, and I can speak to that personally, that really do care about wellness. And I think that as we continue on in this journey, that if you haven't implemented a wellness program, that should be part of your plan as you, either continue to operate or you reopen. What are the kinds of things that you're doing to make sure that physically and mentally that your workforce is operating, all systems go, and that everybody is traveling forward in the most productive way, while being mindful that, listen, on some level, we're not good to anyone else unless we take care of ourselves.
Absolutely, because stress taxes every system. And that does not put us in a great situation given what we're trying to navigate, on our health front right now. So now more than ever before, wellness has become a conversation that and a focal point of every leader's conversation. So I wanted to make sure we didn't leave that part out.
No, I think that it's really important to talk about it because, like I said, from my perspective, that is something that, people really are concerned about. I mean, and I know it's even a question, and I feel so bad because there's so many, and we're just not going to be able to get to all of them. So,
today we won't get to them today.
We'll just keep the conversation going. I really hope that everybody liked this, but we got a question from Renata, who had asked about mental health issues and employees and dealing with that and navigating that. And like we said, and I think it's important, really to end on talking about that, is that we really have to shape what we want as we move forward. We have to encourage people to take care of themselves. We have to let them know and continue to say, listen, we care about your safety, we care about your concerns, we want to continue this dialogue. We want you to feel safe and having a communication with us that that this is sort of a safe space to talk about these things, because the reality is like I said, we need to take care of each other. We need to take care of our employees, and they need to show up for us. And we need to be mindful of that because it's scary, and we don't really know what's going to happen. We're just doing the best that we can, but, we always have to go back to what we know. And there's certain things that we know that will help and will facilitate us as we transition forward.
Right. For me, if I had a closing thought, it would just be restoring humanity, in how we work.
Yeah.
Is a large part of that. And like you said, people said, what consideration will we give to mental health? I think that's a very, very heightened context, but I think we could replace that with any other concern that a person has. And then it gives us a greater sense of compassion and even openness, so that we can expand our own awareness and where we might be on those things.
No,
I think we'll be good.
No, I think, listen, the reality is we will be good. We will prevail.
We are resilient. We are resilient, which is that balance of adaptability and fortitude, right? And so I think we have that.
No, 100%. We'll make it work. We'll figure it out as we go forward. So, thank you everyone for tuning in. I hope that you all found this informative. I know I love talking to Shanequa. She's so great. And, it's so good. Hear that different perspective and, to bounce ideas off of each other, because hopefully that you'll find something in it that's helpful, that speaks to you and what we were talking about. If you liked it, let us know. So if you're seeing it on Facebook, hit like, thumbs up. If you're watching it on YouTube, once we get it up on YouTube, hit like. If we're not doing something that you'd like to see, or if there's something we could do better, let us know that too. We're receptive to what you have to say. Hopefully Shanequa, you and I can do this again, because I did enjoy this a whole lot. And for those of you who want to reach out to me, my information's on the screen. You can feel free to email me. And of course, Shanequa's information is on the screen. And so obviously feel free to, I love it that her email actually says connect. So feel free to connect to her and, drop her a line, talk to her, and, hopefully, between me and her, we can help you navigate this together.
Thank you for having me today.